We are live. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chart Chat, your monthly dose of data viz debate and deep dives. And guess what? We have a humdinger of an episode today. Let's get on with some introductions straight away. First of all, I'm Andy Cotgreave, technical evangelist at Tableau and co-author of Big Book of Dashboards. Got three co-hosts and one special guest. Let's go around the table. Jeff, say hi.
Jeff Schaefer here, Chief Operating Officer and Vice President of IT and Analytics at Unifund in Cincinnati, Ohio, and also Adjunct Professor of Data Visualization at the University of Cincinnati. Steve?
Hi, Jeff. Steve?
Hey, I'm Steve Wexler, Founder, Principal, Sole Employee at Data Revelations. I'm one of the three authors of the Big Book of Dashboards and the author of The Big Picture, and handing things over to Amanda.
Hello, my name is Amanda McCulloch. I am the Executive Director for the Data Visualization Society, and perhaps germane to today's conversation, I'm an expert in public health data visualization. And I'll pass it back to you, Andy, to introduce our special guest today.
Yeah, well, we are very, very excited to be joined by Joss Fong, video journalist at Vox. Is that the right job title, Joss?
Yep, senior video producer. I've been there for almost 8 years now. I'm making videos for Vox's YouTube channel.
Fantastic. Well, welcome along, Joss. We'll get a deeper introduction from you in a moment as we sort of watch the start of one of the videos you've created. So today, this is Chart Chat. Just to give you a little bit of background, we are here to not give you just chit chat. It's Chart Chat, and that is the best slogan you'll hear in the next hour. We started these videos after writing the Big Book of Dashboards and realizing that the conversation Steve, Jeff, and I had, the ins and outs of axes, shapes, marks, and data story design was really rewarding for the three of us. And so we wanted to bring those debates to life on YouTube. We were joined by Amanda some episodes ago, and every now and then we have a guest. So please also, you are welcome too. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We want to know where around the world you're from. You are encouraged to disagree or agree or comment or ask questions. We can all see the comments as they come in. So get involved and we'll take on your considerations too as we go. Today, we are talking about a video Joss made. Unfortunately, StreamYard didn't render the slides as it looks in my PowerPoint, but there you go. Anyway, Joss's most recent video is how American conservatives turned against the COVID vaccine. And it is one of the best examples of data storytelling we've seen in years. So we've asked Joss on to give us some insight on how she went from Google Sheets and storyboards to, chef's kiss, exquisite video data stories. We're going to talk for between 45 minutes and an hour. And then now, surely, can we say it's world famous after party is coming up after that? So at the end of this live broadcast, we're going to close the broadcast down, and we'll all head over to a Zoom where you can open your camera, you can open your mic, and share your thoughts about what we've talked about in the live show. The good news is, Joss is going to stick around as well, so you can ask Joss the questions we perhaps didn't get around to in this call. Whew, right. Well, there you go. That seems to me to be enough introduction. Let's get on and show a little segment of Josh's video. So it's a 15-minute video. We're going to look at 3 or 4 segments throughout the next 45 minutes to an hour and use those as frameworks to dig into Josh's motivations and learnings about storytelling. So here we go. Let's start off and look at the first minute or so of the video.
We're entering the 3rd year of the pandemic, and in the US, the loss of life, month by month, for 2 years, looks like this. Altogether, more than 900,000 people have died. But there really are 2 pandemics here, because starting in the spring of 2021, the distribution of the vaccines dramatically changed the nature of the pandemic. If we look closer at the Delta wave and the beginning of Omicron, we see that the deaths of unvaccinated people were much higher than vaccinated people. This data comes from a subset of US states and cities that provide immunization data. While the Delta wave did kill some vaccinated people, the risk was 15 times higher if you were unvaccinated.
Philly Baird was one of those unvaccinated people.
All right, and that's the sort of setup for the video, and you've already seen a few some of the things that Joss was doing with the charts to begin to tell that story. So, Joss, welcome to the show. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the motivation for the video, and that can set us up for the storytelling techniques you've used in it?
Sure. And I should credit NPR for sparking the idea in my head to do this video. I had seen a piece that they published about what they had done was looked at county data, and they had all of the counties in the US plotted by their death rate, their COVID death rates, and by the share of the popular vote that went to Donald Trump. So it basically just showed kind of roughly the political distribution of who was dying from COVID-19 since the vaccines came out in spring of 2021. And it was very clear to me at that moment, and they weren't the only ones that were reporting this, but that since the vaccines arrived, there had developed this sort of political lean in the sort of death burden from this disease. And so I really wanted to dig into that. I wanted to hold people accountable for this. These are, sorry, I live in a very noisy corner of Brooklyn, so there's always sirens. I can't do it.
It's okay.
So basically, the relationships that I wanted to focus on were sort of the relationship between vaccine rates and death rates. We realized very early on that the vaccines were highly preventative of death from COVID-19. We wanted to look at the relationship between sort of vaccine rates and politics, and where you see is the areas of the United States that were more Republican had lower vaccine rates, and then from there you can look at the relationship between politics and death rates, and that's where you see that sort of conservatives were bearing a bigger burden of death from COVID-19. And it seemed to me that this was a result of vaccine misinformation. And I wanted to drill in, do some interviews, try to figure out who these people and their families were listening to that made them think that they should not opt into this life-saving medicine. And so the idea was that we would sort of focus on those few data points, maybe, one core chart, and then pair it with some interviews with conservatives in the US and family members of people who had died, and try to figure out like exactly who was responsible for this. And then as I did more reporting, I decided that, there was a much bigger story here to sort of lay out through many more charts than I initially intended. I think we ended up with 15 so that we could sort of fill in the picture of how we got to this point rather than just saying, this is where we are.
That's amazing. So I think a core lesson there is it's not just about the charts, right? There's obviously a much bigger picture than this. And obviously here we're talking about charts, but the charts serve a bigger picture, right?
Right. And a big part of this was that I wanted to have voices of people who were directly affected by this. In my social circle, in my context, it was just obvious. Everyone I knew and all of my family members would be vaccinated as soon as they could. That's just not the case for lots of Americans. It wasn't a foregone conclusion that this is something that they would choose. And I wanted to make sure that you heard from them and actually saw the impact. And that's where we brought in a few interviews. One was a survivor of COVID-19 who had hesitated about the vaccine because of politics. And the two other are people who had lost loved ones to this. And we pulled in some of their sort of social media postings to kind of fill out, try to show that this is a human being who had these sort of competing messages coming from them, from the media that they were exposed to, and who, obviously had personal responsibility for the choices that they made, but were under the influence of a lot of different forces.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's take a look at a second bit of the story and maybe dig into how you as a videographer think of data visualization as a way to support the story. So let's play the next section.
Directly by their 2020 election results, with the red states on the right and the blue states on the left. And we can look at their death rates since April 2021, and it's pretty striking. The Republican states were suffering much bigger losses. And I want to stress that this relationship wasn't there before the vaccines. This is the same chart, but it shows death rates before April 2021. And they're much more spread out, with COVID hitting blue states as hard as red ones. So what I want to understand is the series of events that took us from this to this.
The Democrats are in a full court freakout over
So we're beginning to see, we've seen scissors, acetates, Sharpies, and rulers so far, all in video. So what is it, Joss, that is video? Tell us about video and data storytelling. Where's the genesis for this video come from?
Yeah, this is a format that I have tried before in the sense that you print out a series of charts and sort of draw on them. I did that a few years back. For this one, I was able to collaborate with a designer, Aaron Filke, who was able to really elevate sort of the production value of it. And he brought in this idea of layering on data with transparencies, which sort of opened up some new techniques that we hadn't tried before, because you can kind of move around pieces of data. But the whole idea was that we're going to be showing a whole lot of charts. And in order to keep that sort of interesting and diverse, we would need to come up with different ways to manipulate those charts, different ways to present that data. And so that's why we started to bring in some of these other techniques.
And I know Jeff is good. Well, and tell us, what's your hypothesis about video and data visualization?
Yeah, I think that video is probably the best way to present data, and that's probably a bit of a controversial statement. And I'm obviously I'm like a video supremacist. I have a very strong bias to video as a medium of communication, but it just has these really inherent strengths. One being that you can reveal things at different times. You can use a voiceover to guide people through it so that they're not lost, and that you can use motion to draw the eye to whatever you want people to be looking at any given moment. And that combination of tools, I think, helps make data much more relatable, much more memorable, and helps people take away from the visualization what you intend them to take away from it.
Absolutely. Now, Jeff, I know like you're static and interactives. What do you think? Joss has laid down a gauntlet here. Video is the best way, the best form for data visualization. What do you think?
Well, I mean, some great points, right? Like motion just in and of itself is probably the strongest pre-attentive attribute. It's so strong, like it's almost too strong sometimes, right? You have to be careful about overusing animation, because I think you might distract from the data in some instances. But I also wonder about the medium. Like the time it takes to put something together. I don't know how many hours it took to do a video like this that you might not have the luxury of. Somebody said, imagine a business presentation, but a chart or a graph that might take you a few hours, or a dashboard that could take you a few days. Something like this, I don't know on a time scale if it can compete with that. And then I wonder about just the delivery of it, right? Like we're not in a place all the time where maybe video is the best way to view it. It's powerful. Absolutely. But will it work as effectively in a boardroom on if we're delivering things on paper, oftentimes, believe it or not, right?
Yeah, that's all very true. And I love seeing charts in a static form coming across my Twitter feed or my Instagram feed. Very likely to share those images. I think they're extremely powerful. When it comes to doing sort of a story that you want to have a pretty decent shelf life and make a pretty big impact, that's where I think video is a good thing to consider when you have sort of something that's really large that you want to get across. I think it's great. And I don't think people should be intimidated by the kind of time and skills it takes to make video, because as we show in this, it's pretty lo-fi. Obviously, there's a million animation tools you can use instead, and Box often uses After Effects to do data visualization. But if you can print things out and you have Google Sheets or Excel that's generating a pretty rudimentary chart, it can be pretty much just as impactful as something that a professional graphic designer has worked on. And if you have an iPhone, you have a camera.
I'd also add it kind of boxes you into the explanatory category, right? Like if I can contrast it to maybe a business dashboard that might be in the exploratory or monitoring category, it'd be interesting to think, like, would it be possible to make videos that are exploratory where you could divert paths along the way or something? But it's Josh's video is a perfect example of an explanatory viz.
And I'd also argue that this is the set where we see this distinction between data visualization and data storytelling. And part of me is thinking, what we should do to make this the best chart chat ever? Let's just all watch the video for 15 minutes because it is just brilliant data storytelling. But I don't think just anyone can do something like this. I think this is something that's in Hans Rosling type of category and of data storytelling and figuring out what is the thing that's going to get this across and get people to understand it. I also want to point out to people who follow this, there is not one Voronoi tree map or Sankey diagram in this thing. Everything are very simple charts, brilliantly explained, and sometimes just moving things by hand really get the thing across. So if I were the data storytelling versus data visualization, and as Jeff pointed out, some of the brilliant stuff that we'll see in the New York Times and in The Economist, I'm thinking particularly the New York Times, is they'll make a key point and have some data storytelling and walk you through something, but then they'll give you some tool where, if you want to explore how this pertains to your neighborhood or your area or your demographic, go ahead and do that. So they'll have a particular narrative, but they'll say, well, now create your own story on this thing.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing you do really well in the clip that Andy showed too, Joss, is I think you frame it as in a way that a New York Times article doesn't, which is here's the result of a lot of analysis and a lot of really in-depth journalism. You frame out the question you try to answer. And I personally found that to be one of the really compelling points is saying, I'm not just showing you a series of charts because I think they're useful data. I saw this change and this shift in this kind of period of the pandemic and in what was happening with these death rates. How can I understand it and dig into it and understand it better? And so I feel like it takes you on this kind of exploratory journey that I think we can all learn from a little bit in terms of how do you dig and keep asking more and more questions, but why, that I think can help teach people to be better consumers of data, to kind of question and dig deeper into charts and graphs that I thought was really, really well done. And I love that you picked that clip, Andy, in terms of showcasing kind of what that question is that Joss really digs into.
Yeah.
Yeah, what you see in that video is basically my reporting process happening in front of you. Obviously, it's very heavily edited, but it's pretty much just a portrayal of me trying to figure this out. And you see sort of the part where I'm really like, okay, I think vaccine misinformation is really behind this. And then you see this sort of turning point where, well, this vaccine hesitancy predates the vaccines and predates most of the vaccine misinformation that had been published. And so I think that was it was natural for me to make this story structured in the same way that my own thinking process was structured. But I also think that it might help bridge the gap of trust that the news media has with the people that I'm talking about in this piece particularly. And I can't tell you anything about whether this reached beyond Vox's normal audience, but I definitely think that showing that process and being as transparent as possible about my own effort to understand it might have helped with this exact issue of this breakdown of trust that is behind a lot of the trends that we see in the piece.
Fascinating. And so when you say the reporting process, what I've just frozen there on the screen is you're essentially making a flip chart, which is an animation between before the vaccine and after the vaccine to show that transition. And yeah, that's the data exploration phase that we would do when we explore the data, and you've brought it to life.
Yeah, that was the question I had when I saw the NPR piece, is that, and this is something that the New York Times has been reporting on too, and they call it red COVID, is since the vaccines came out, we saw this trend. And I wanted to say, okay, so what did it look like before? Because that was going to be really helpful in making sure that what we were seeing was a real shift that we could attribute to some of these political and social forces. And so that's when I had to go back and collect all of the data from the beginning of the pandemic to the arrival of the vaccines to make sure that pattern wasn't there before and, attributable to something completely unrelated to this story.
Yeah. Some great comments. Ellie says, Steve's just compared Joss Fong to Hans Rosling. Absolutely valid comparisons, I think. Steve, I challenge, I think you said not anybody can do this. I respectfully disagree, right? Joss has been doing this for 8 years. So was it 8 years, 9 years? So the skills are clearly honed. You know, you and I and the four of us on the four of us co-hosts, we've been doing it for probably combined 50 years at least in terms of combined years. But it's a learnable skill, right? It's a case of what Joss is doing is drawing attention to a particular part of the chart, making a flip, making a transition, and using annotations to bring attention to it. Steve.
Okay, fair enough. And the techniques and the storytelling and we're going to see some great ways of making paired bar charts, something I usually don't like, work incredibly well. What I'm saying is, yes, we can do this, we can learn from it, but hey, can I run a race? Yes. Am I going to run a marathon in 2 hours and 10 minutes? I don't think so. So the yes, apply these things, do it to your own work, take something away, steal like an artist to make something. I've said this to my family who knows what I do, is that, you know, I don't think I will ever make anything as good as this. So by all means, borrow from it, but I don't think, you know, it's something that is so good, so compelling. All the sorry, I'm gushing here.
I have confidence in you, Steve. I think you can do it.
I just don't see making something quite that good. But also the amount of time that we haven't asked this. How many people worked on this from beginning to end, from when you said, you know, this NPR piece inspires me, I think I want to do something about this? When did you first get the idea, and when did this thing hit? Well, it hit a few weeks ago. And the other is, you know, how many hours does it take to make something like this?
Yeah, this was a big one. And that's where you really, it shows how valuable it is to have an organization that lets you spend the time doing the kind of exploring I did with this. But from the time that I pitched the story to the time that we published it, it was 7 weeks. And 5 of those weeks were just research, interviews, and writing. So that was just key. You know, I needed to figure this out. If I tried to run with the story that I had initially pitched, which was based on a fairly shallow understanding, you know, it would have been a very different, much more limited result. So that was one aspect. The other aspect was that I worked with a researcher, Hallie Brown, who helped me source the interviews that you see in this piece. So she did a lot of the basic work of finding people who would be good for speaking directly to the personal experience of losing someone to COVID, talking, you know, reaching out to them over email and making sure that they would feel comfortable talking to us for a story like this. So that was super helpful. And then obviously the collaborator that I had on the visuals did all of the graphic design of the charts and helped help me shoot the piece.
Should we let's talk about that right now, shall we? So you've shared with us some of the Genesis story. So the data aspect, which I guess we'll focus on for Chart Chat rather than the videos. Do you want to talk through the process in a little bit more detail? We can show some of the pictures you shared as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this was sort of the key data points of the piece, and the ones that I had initially pitched was these 3 relationships between vaccines, politics, and deaths. And I would have loved to do this on a county basis. There's a really great health policy blogger, Charles Gaba, who's been putting out county data for many, many months that shows this. I simply do not have the data viz skills to deal with that many data points and make sure that the data is comparable and clean and all of that. So I just went with the state data, knowing that it was representative of what you would look at if you looked at finer data. And so I had 50 states to look through. I made sure that I had age standardized them so that we weren't just showing some relationship between age and Republican voters. And then, you know, plotted them here. And so what I did was generate a series of really ugly Google Sheets charts. And that's what I handed to Aaron, the graphic designer, who made them much more beautiful.
And that looked something like this. So right. Is this what you hand over, is it?
Right. So this is the spreadsheet that I handed to him. It had sort of the title and the copy for each chart and the reference with the data sources. So he what's cool about Google Sheets, and I don't know if they've always done this, but they allow you to export an SVG file. So he could port over the data in a way that would allow it to be edited in Adobe Illustrator. So he didn't have to like retrace every dot. So that was super helpful. But yeah, this had all 15 charts, this document. And if you look closely, you can see like what exact motion I'm going to be adding to it when we shoot. So the labels, the axis labels in this first one were going to be left off of the print so that I could write them in to make sure that people really focused on what those axes were. And then, yeah, so this is the actual shot list for the shoot. Because I couldn't keep track of all these things in my mind, when it was time to shoot chart number 5, it was like, okay, yes, I need to write down the axis label, and then I need to draw the trend line. And then I need to pull on, chart 5 and flip back and forth. And so this is how I kept everything organized in my mind while we were shooting.
And this is so interesting because the amount of the level of detail here. So if we circle back to the video or interactive, my feeling is that when you're creating a video or doing this in a presentation, you could do a lot of this as part of a presentation. You control the story, and that is incredibly powerful because nobody can misinterpret what you let's assume nobody will misinterpret what you're saying because you've done things clearly. Whenever you print something or email something, you're not as in control there, are you? I think that's a good power of the presentation or the video side of things. Wanda says, part of the beauty of Hans Rosling's presentation that Joss also employs is the combo of physical interaction with the data animation. So the physical touching of the data elevates it. Do you want to... Where did those ideas come from? Because we're going to see some more acetate involvement in a minute, but we've seen the scissors and the Sharpie. Why do you think that enhances things?
Yeah, I wish I knew. I don't know what it is, but it's definitely something that has emerged as a powerful tool in digital video is to see hands do things. And I think it was BuzzFeed with Tasty that figured out that this was going to be a really powerful way to show cooking videos. I don't know if you guys have seen those videos, but just seeing hands completed action. I don't know if it's that you can imagine yourself doing that more, or if you get a better sense that this is a process that has an ending that it's building to that kind of boosts the retention. But there's something that's very satisfying about watching hands do things, and also that seems to grab onto people's attention in a way that keeps them engaged for longer than if we would use our typical tool, which would be motion graphics, just no hands at all. But
yeah.
I don't know what exactly is behind it, but I do know it's powerful. And another aspect of it that is kind of easy to ignore, but I wanted to make sure was included, is that we had a microphone recording the sounds on the table. And just having that layer of audio on the timeline, so that it's pretty subtle, but you can hear the marker and you can hear the scissors. It just gives it that extra boost of, it's almost like ASMR, but I wouldn't exactly attribute
Yeah.
it to that. But it's tapping into some of those same sensory alchemy kind of stuff that happens with this kind of video.
All right. I'm just going to ask my co-host if they have any other comments before we move on to the next section. But I like Pam's comment. She says, story is a good place to start, but at certain times during the storytelling, I want to stop and interact with what I'm being presented. A video doesn't allow for that. And yes, I think fair enough. But Spencer then replied saying, but one of the pudding approaches is that they walk you through the narrative and then give you the interactive at the end, which is perhaps a way to try and provide the best of all worlds. Any other comments, co-hosts, or questions?
You may have this queued up later, Andy, but I was just going to ask, how many takes did it need? How many times did you have to record it?
We printed out 3 versions of every chart, and I think we used all of those on most of them, just because my handwriting would be bad on one, or the marker was not as bold as I expected. So it was 3 takes for each chart, and the way that you can kind of make it work smoothly is sort of remove your hands from the frame after every movement. Although I ended up making it pretty jump cutty in the end, it's not too jarring to see the hands kind of jumping around. And this is my apartment. We shot in my apartment, and it's basically a Canon 5D pointed straight down. A key thing if you're going to make a video like this is to have a monitor, which you can see sort of right above my head, so that I could see what the camera was seeing. Both of those things were plugged into electricity instead of relying on batteries, so we wouldn't have to change those too many times. And honestly, the shooting process was fairly smooth.
I love the stairs. I just love that there are stairs there to climb up to get up to those things. As a person who's a little bit shorter, I appreciate that. And I mean, it's interesting to me because would you have usually shot this in a more formal studio that you all have set up, but the pandemic shifted you to being at home, or is that just a consequence of how your team normally works?
Yeah, I think the pandemic has definitely gotten us into the mode of shooting at home. And especially, I worked on a YouTube original show called Glad You Asked that was hosted that involved a lot of me shooting by myself at home. So I got kind of used to it, and it's just a sort of comfortable atmosphere. I also happen to have a space that's big enough to do that. But we could have done exactly the same thing in Vox Media's studios, and just set up a table there. But it wouldn't have been sort of ready to go either way. It would require set up, renting the gear from the studio room and getting a table and doing all of that.
Great. All right. I love that you say that's quite a simple setup. I just like Tableau desktop on my laptop. Right. Great. Let's move on to the next one. I think we're going to see. I think we've got. Oh, it's not quite Steve's favorite one yet. We'll do that one in a second, but let's move on, see what happens.
We're slightly less likely to say they should be required, but it's nothing like the 30-point gap that we see in COVID vaccination rates today. One way to understand that gap is to consider the vastly different information environments that Republicans and Democrats live in. This is a list of news sources trusted by at least 40% of Democrats, according to a 2019 survey by Pew.
Health officials worried.
Highest daily rate.
The COVID variant was first
latest
reported
data from the Centers.
And here's a list of news sources trusted by at least 40% of Republicans. What this means is that American conservatives are quite exposed to the editorial choices of a single network.
So this one's quite compelling as a word cloud. How did this one emerge? Because it's obviously not a bar chart; it's just words.
Yeah, this is I think it's the only non-chart in the thing, but it's just such a key point in terms of everything that led up to conservatives being exposed to a certain set of media figures who honestly were, Tucker Carlson was just extremely irresponsible with the health of his own audience. And he's the most popular host on Fox News. And so I think it was just a point that had to be included. This research came from Pew. I think they often ask people what media sources they trust. And this is a very consistent finding, basically since the 90s when Fox News came out, is that Democrats tend to trust a variety of news sources and Republicans tend to trust one major news source. That is a very long-term trend that goes back, beyond Fox News to Rush Limbaugh, and this message that went out to conservatives that you cannot trust anybody but us. Like, they are all biased, but we're not. And that collected this segment of the American population into their audience, and in a way that has been harmful in various ways, but has never been as immediately deadly as it is when the pandemic hits and the vaccines come out. And so this taps into some of these really long-term trends that go back to the roots of the kind of cultural and social and political polarization that are just like making us move further and further away from each other. And I think you could do a whole other video about how we got to that point, but I just wanted to make sure that it was included in this one. And it was one of my editors who suggested editing in the audio clips there that I think helped elevate this a little bit more. But basically, yeah, it's very straightforward. It's just a list. And it's just pretty much what Pew is this.
I'm so struck by looking at this. Yes, could have been a bar chart, but it's I think much more effective this way. It is my favorite clip of this entire video, even though it's maybe one of the less charty versions. And one of the things you just said, I think, is really pointed, and I'm curious how it had you think about the other charts you presented, which in the context of a pandemic and where individual behaviors and choices that have a community impact actually can be shaped by the information we consume. How did that kind of ethical quandary influence you at all in terms of how you approach presenting the other charts and graphs throughout this video?
Yeah, I was very aware that as I was writing the story, I was not separate from it, but in fact, like very much in it as an example of a new media source, an online media source that an audience kind of selects into. I mean, I think that our reporters are very fair, but we probably don't reflect the priorities or opinions of conservatives very often, and they would not probably opt into to reading Vox or watching Vox videos. And so it's frustrating because I really did try to approach this as fair as possible. And I would have loved to reach out beyond our typical audience. And I think that some of the comments that I've read and some of the emails I've got suggest that has been the case, at least a little bit. So that's been good to see.
Great. Okay, let's move on to I think Steve's favorite moment. One of the acetate moments that makes Steve think about population pyramids. So here in this clip, you're continuing to talk about news sources, but I'll let Steve come up, ask you a question after this, or make a comment.
They would definitely
sorry.
not. If we compare the information sources of those who said they definitely get vaccinated with the information sources of those who said they would definitely not get vaccinated, we see that the vaccine resistors were less likely to consume most news sources, except for two: Fox News and social media.
So, Steve, yeah, there you go. I'll pause it on the acetate flip. Steve.
Oh, nicely done there. I'm hardly going to say this is my favorite. I mean, this is there are so many high points in this. I was just excited because as we're teaching things a little more mundane, the problems with showing something like a population pyramid, where you have the population of men on one side and the population of women on the other side, and it's how many people are newborns, 1-year-old, 2-year-olds, et cetera, and eventually get to 90-year-olds, and everything goes. There aren't that many 90-plus-year-olds living. You can't compare, well, are there more men than women? Well, they're going in the opposite direction. So just this physical flipping of the thing points out, well, here's the problem with the population pyramid. You can't see, is this bar bigger than this one, smaller, and by how much? So just seeing that done points out how you can take something which has some shortcomings in it and then make it, oh, well, now we can do the accurate comparison on it. So it was an exciting teaching moment for me.
Yeah, this is definitely, I've had mixed feelings about doing this because I recognize that we sacrificed the sort of comprehensibility of the beginning of this segment in order to emphasize the point that I'm making at the end of it. And that's just it's also an issue with video is when you're condensing, when you're sort of putting a time box on a visualization, the way that video does, and the eyes are flying all over the place and they don't know what to look at, isolating what matters is more important in this medium than anything. And so that's where we decided to try this just to hit that one point, because I originally had it stacked in a normal bar chart, and it's just a lot for people to look at. And even if you start drawing those arrows, I think it was an interesting way for us to draw out the difference and to play with the transparency aspect of it.
Oh, it's great, and you can even see the stuff kind of peeking through behind it, but killer point, and I think a great way to show it.
Absolutely, Josh, you said my favorite thing. If there's one thing that anybody watching can do to improve their presentations, whether it's about data or just about anything, but particularly when they're presenting charts, is think for every sentence that comes out of your mouth, where should the viewers be looking at that given time? It's no use to say, as you can see, the chart shows that sales targets are going up next year in France. If you're not drawing my eyes to France and that mark that has sales targets on it, I cannot see that. You have to draw the eye's attention in whatever means you can, and you do it here with Sharpies. Excellent, and many things. Amanda.
Yes. question on just the editing down on this too. Having just watched the vaccine monitor for a while, am I remembering correctly that definitely and definitely not are not the only two choices for survey respondents? There's an in-between option, which is why the kind of total size of the bars is different.
Yes, they had a whole list of probably not, definitely not sure. I think they asked people all of those things. And originally planning to kind of show it all because it's pretty interesting. And it's interesting when you look at some other demographic groups, how they map on differently. For instance, some ethnic minorities were hesitant at first, but hesitant in a different way than American conservatives were hesitant, and in a way that kind of went away as the pandemic, as the vaccine rollout went on. In this case, I thought I just wanted to really compare those camps, especially the definitely not people, because those people have held so steady since before the vaccines to 2 years after the vaccines, that I felt like it was going to be the best way to draw out what was unique about the information sources that they had.
Yeah. And I think that's an interesting editing down question, right? Around in these kind of environments where a lot of additional categories would have maybe muddled that story. The decision to only show those two more extreme categories rather than all the intermediary ones, which as a healthcare professional, I might really want to see kind of how the share of people who are the maybes are changing, because the probablys or the kind of maybe or the less certain decisions, because those are the ones where I feel like I might be able to change hearts and minds to convince them to get vaccinated. Whereas I think that it's a lot harder to budge, like you said, the folks who have landed in this firm far to the extreme category.
Exactly. And that's where I should shout out the Kaiser Family Foundation for putting out this resource too. This vaccine monitor that they were updating monthly for over a year had such rich data, and so much more than you see in this. So if you're interested in this topic, definitely look at their site because it's just a wealth of information.
Absolutely. Right, we had a question. I think, yeah, Tanushree, just can you elaborate on the tools you used again here, Josh? So you've talked about Google Sheets, Excel, PowerPoint, and then what does Aaron use to get these into beautiful shape?
That would be Adobe Illustrator. So that's a key tool for graphic designers. It also happens to work really well with video editing tools. So once the charts were designed and printed and shot, then that was all edited in Adobe Premiere.
All right, fantastic. And obviously, I'd recommend Tableau. That's I use that for all my presentation design. You can't get quite as slick as Joss's work here, but there you go. Right, let's move on to one last clip, which comes towards the end of the video, and I think begins to frame out some of your conclusions. So here we go.
Why a big chunk of Republican voters had already turned against the vaccine 6 months before the presidential election and nearly a whole year before the vaccines were even available. I think the answer is somewhere in here. Of the 8 false claims polled by the Kaiser Family Foundation, the one most widely believed wasn't about vaccines at all.
And so of the different pieces of misinformation we tested, the most commonly believed overall and particularly by Republicans was this idea that the government was inflating the number of deaths due to COVID-19.
And there
They believed
we had the rather spectacular gatefold. So my question here, Joss, is: are there any other ways you could interact with physically, with charts physically that you didn't include in this video?
I'm sure there are, and I would like to explore some more. But this is one where that bar was just so huge that it occurred to me that we could do this little extra emphasis on it. But I think we're really just scratching the surface of the ways you could play with these. I mean, you could take it probably to a 3D space, and sort of build out a world of charts that's actually not flat. I don't know how to do that yet, but it's something to explore. But what you see, and I see a very active debate about the value of pie charts, but what you see is a clear interest on my part in making sure we were not just showing the same type of chart over and over and over again. And so there's some sacrifices that happen there when you just want diversity of visuals for the sake of a compelling, video. But this was one example of, it's like, okay, it's another bar chart. What else can we do?
Yeah, I agree. Now, Carlos has asked the 3D charts, oh no question, but in the presentation space, I'm done with sensitivity and care. I too believe there can be a space for 3D charts. We've all seen many 3D chart crimes committed in many locations, but with increasing video technology, perhaps that time is going to re-emerge. Co-hosts, any more questions for Joss? And viewers, do you have any questions to ask Joss in this section?
Well, for me, this gatefold thing, I mean, this is like a mic drop moment, and it's so simple, but it's so effective. And I'm wondering about some of your, people whose work you admire or seen that may have served as inspiration. Some of the hand-drawn stuff, some of the, oh, I'm going to do something really dramatic here. I think of Hans Rosling. He once had like a 15-foot pointer. Instead of having a mouse pointer, he had this giant thing. Or Al Gore in the worker bucket during the Inconvenient Truth, where he's showing how much higher this thing would be. But I'm hard pressed to come up with something as effective as this to show just how big the gap is. So I'm wondering, was this the big aha moment for you? What made you think, oh, I'm gonna do this, fold this thing out?
I think it's just that same thing of, what can you hold back a little bit in order to have a more impactful moment when you deliver the line? So it's just a matter of trying to preserve some element of surprise, which is difficult when you've pre-printed and pre-designed everything. I think that something that some people might do, and something that Vox has tried to do, is actually build the chart in the video. Like, I could have drawn this line, but I think that there's a difficult balance between the credibility and that approach. I think as long as people see that it's been printed, they sort of trust the data. Whereas if I had come up with some other way, maybe like laid out a piece of tape that was as long as that line, it would have felt maybe like I was less precise. But there's definitely lots of ways to do that. The key just being that you want to kind of reveal this extra, it's literally just like putting a period on the sentence in a way that's going to be as impactful as possible, using the element of surprise. And all those references that you mentioned, I'm sure I have absorbed culturally. There's been just a huge explosion of effective data visualization and data storytelling that I've come across, and I'm sure has influenced me in a million different ways.
Joss, I've got to know, when you're working on this stuff, does it haunt you at night? Is your mind constantly thinking about this stuff? That you as you're trying to sleep, ideas are in your head, and then you get, oh my gosh, I know how we're going to do this. We're going to fold out this sheet or something like that. Is it, to what degree does this stuff haunt you while you're working on it?
Oh, 100%. I mean, for this one, it was like I was just living and breathing it nights and mostly during the research phase of just like really wanting to get it right and to be as accurate as possible. And then when it came to the visualization, just really thinking about, well, one, just making sure everything was correct, going back and rechecking things. 'Cause once you print one of these things, it's very difficult to correct. And once it's out there, you just want to make sure everything's correct. So a lot of my waking up in the middle of the night was, oh, I need to age standardize the data. I hadn't thought of that initially, but I thought, well, how do I make sure that this is bulletproof? So a lot of it is accuracy related, but yeah, a lot of creative ideas. When you're sort of in the abyss of making a story like this, you're in the shower and things are coming to you. A lot of this happens in conversation with collaborators, which is so helpful in coming up with ideas that you wouldn't think of on your own as well.
Collaborators, that's another trigger word to make us all sing with joy, because that's why we're doing Chart Chat. The collaboration during writing the book was incredible. Spencer asked a question which I think you've largely answered. Were there any other techniques to keep potential inaccuracies or to deal with potential inaccuracies? I think you've probably covered all of that.
Well, in terms of the sort of the shelf life of the piece, it was really tough because 7 weeks went by from when I basically stopped collecting data to when this thing went out into the world. And one of the things I wish I had anticipated more was that sort of the definition of fully vaccinated is shifting. I think with the new variants, you really need a booster if you want to have that same level of protection. And all of the data kind of assumed fully vaccinated meant 2 shots. So if I had thought a little bit more about the boosters and, you know, what regime of boosting we'll have going forward, I think I would have been able to make this a little bit more forward compatible. Of course, I don't know what's coming, but I do think that it will continue to be relevant to the booster conversation. And so I think I could have angled it a little bit more to make sure that this was relevant to that too, as most of what I was talking about was the Delta wave, which was just so devastating. I think, you know, over 100,000 preventable deaths. And it's going to continue going on as these people who are hesitant about the initial vaccine are also hesitant about boosting. So there's a little bit from the sociologist I interviewed that sort of hints at that, but I wish I would have thought about that more.
Yeah, great. Next year perhaps another story. We didn't mention it, but on screen is the screenshot from your video editing process as well, which I figured is partly what keeps you awake at night as you're trying to work through that process.
Yeah, it's also what scares Steve from wanting to make data videos is seeing this kind of number of different compelling, different streams of audio and video content. Yeah. I know it gives me a little bit of a heart palpitation when I see that.
Yeah, it's really intimidating. But I think I don't know if you can see them all, but like 4 of these bars are music. And so you can kind of lean into that as much as you want. Vox has always leaned into music. It's sort of controversial in the news broadcast space, how ethical or proper it is to use so much music. But I think for us, for the younger generation, it's just an obvious thing you need to compete with everything else that's available for people to watch in any given moment. But so that if you take out the music, it's much more approachable timeline here.
I'm never going to forget that you had a microphone right next to your hand to capture all those little sounds because they were really impactful, but I hadn't thought about just like the logistics of how to actually make that happen until you said it out loud. And I was like, of course that's necessary. But it is a brilliant additional step in terms of really feeling like you're part of your thinking and drawing and design process.
Amazing. Right. I think with that, it's been remarkable to hear the insights. So thank you so much for taking the time to dig deeply into the video. So before we wrap up, we're going to go and do the after party in a minute. So we'll put a link into chat, which is a Zoom link, and you can all come and ask some more questions of Joss and tell us your comments and thoughts about the storytelling and any disagreements, agreements, or celebrations you wanted to bring to the conversation. So Joss, thanks very much. But let's just wrap up. What have we got to tell you? Notes. Hey, look, this is almost becoming a professional operation, everybody. We actually have dates for not just the next chart chat, but for the next 3 chart chats. Amanda, what's next?
Next month, we are going to be revisiting the Big Book of Dashboards, where I get to go ahead and interview and ask probing and thoughtful questions to my co-hosts, all about their thoughts on the book that they wrote, co-authored, and that was released to all of you about 5 years ago. So I'm excited to get to put them in the hot seat and hear about what they would have done differently, what would have changed, what are their thoughts after 5 years of having a book out in the wild. Kind of like video storytelling. It's really hard to change something once it's gone to press.
That's true. Thanks, Amanda. And Jeff, what are we doing in May?
May is May is live at the Tableau conference. So for anybody who is going to be at the Tableau conference, we will be broadcasting live from there.
Yeah, registration is open now. So hopefully we'll see you in Las Vegas. That'd be great. And then Steve, we even have a chart chat planned for June. More special guests that time. Tell us about June.
We do. We will have Jasper Kroom and Seth Godin, who has been spearheading an initiative called the Carbon Almanac. And we'll be talking about all the work that went into that, including a lot of the charts and infographics. So that will be on June 16th. We don't have a sign-up link for that yet, but we are certainly excited about that. And if time permits, I just want to, I'll defer to you, Andy, but one little thing I want to bring up in Joss's video, but I'll wait for you to finish.
All right. Big Book of Dashboards, workshops, recordings, and resources. Go to the bigbookofdashboards.com. Do we have a public workshop coming up, Steve?
We do. You just go to datarevelations.com. You'll find it, or bigbookofdashboards.com, and look for workshops. We've got a workshop coming up on April 12th. It's over 2 days, April 12th and 14th. And I think there are 3 slots open. So if you're interested, sign up soon.
All right. Steve, I'm going to encourage you to bring your point up in after party as a way of.
All right. I will delay to the after party, but it is there is the key point out of this entire just under 15-minute video. For me, there is one point where I go, okay, now I understand where this is coming from. And you just have to attend the after party to hear what I think that moment is. And if you don't go to the after party, please watch Joss's video and also the interviews that she had with people, because they are key to understanding and appreciating this. It's not just the charts, it's also the interviews that are there. I'm going to leave a little before everybody else because I've got to get that set up. Hope to see a lot of people over at the after party. Thanks so much.
All right. And thanks, Steve. Joss, where can people find you if they're not coming to the after party? How can they get in touch with you?
Well, you can find all of my work on youtube.com/Vox. That's Vox's YouTube channel. I'm also on Twitter at Joss Fong.
All right. Amazing. Go check Voss out. I lost quite a lot of time watching some of her videos and it was time well spent. Jeff has posted the link to the Zoom in the comments. bigpic.me/after28. That will take you to the Zoom if you're coming along. We'll keep this channel open for a minute or so you can copy that link down. But if you're not joining us, I just want to say a huge thank you to Joss. Huge thanks to Steve, Jeff, and Amanda, and to you all for watching. Great comments and questions, and hopefully we've all learned something we can apply in our data viz storytelling skills. So until next time, take care.
Thanks, guys.
Bye, team.